Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to everyone involved, but a special word of thanks to two people. First of all, Eric Mandelbaum, who has done a masterful job in bringing all of us here and has been an inspiration in my life in multiple ways. So thanks to Eric. But a special thanks to Tim, because there are moments in one's professional life where one realizes that one is actually proud of one's profession. And reading Tim's book was one of those moments. And for all of us who suffer from a certain degree of self-hatred and depression, while surveying the works of our esteemed colleagues, to have those moments where we read one who really represents a model of what we would like to see in the profession, what we'd like the profession to be. That's a great pleasure, and Tim has given me that pleasure. So I'm very happy to be here recognizing it. The writing is bad. Is there a way to turn everything? Oh, we have natural light. God is our enemy. I was just saying in the coffee room that I saw Sam Harris give this talk with dramatic lighting, and that it was very effective. The content of the talk was absolute rubbish, but having the dramatic lighting made it seem profound. Oh my God, we're in James Bond's room. Thanks, Q. And somebody suggested that I carry a flashlight and just project it under my nose, not realizing my nose was large enough to obscure all the light, in which case this effect wouldn't work. Here's Tim's nose. This is Tim. Blurry. So Tim has written a book on the unity of consciousness, and he's interested in the question of how different components of experience, like coffee, in its visual aspect and in its olfactory aspect, might be unified in a single experience. So the idea is that when you experience something through multiple senses, or even a different dimension in a single sense, there's a sense in which you get a unified phenomenal field, and that cries out for analysis and explanation. So it's explaining the unity of these features that we're ultimately interested in. Now, I'm going to be somewhat orthogonal to the detail of Tim's book throughout the talk, in large part because I find many of the details, argument by argument, line by line, to be extremely persuasive. So what I'm really going to do is bounce off Tim a little bit, which sounds sexier than it is, and try to think about how my own orientation within consciousness studies relates to the question of unity, and then see whether arguments in Tim's project might be reason for concern. So I think consciousness is intimately tied to attention. I'm not going to give you a full defense of that view, but I'll sketch one. And really the question I'm going to ask is, if consciousness is attention, what's the natural account of unity? That is, what's the best account of how our conscious states get unified? And does this account violate what Tim calls the unity thesis, according to which everything we're conscious of at a moment is unified into a single phenomenal field? So really, I want to take these issues up by turn. I want to talk about the relationship between consciousness and attention. I want to talk about what a theory of unity might look like on a view that relates consciousness to attention. And I'll talk about a possible reason for thinking that the unity thesis is not, in fact, true. Now, why I think consciousness involves attention? As a starting place, the phenomenon of unilateral neglect, in which individuals fail to have experience of things on the left-hand side. That is, they might see these two houses as something like this. First brought neurologists and neuropsychologists to the idea that attention might be crucial for consciousness. Because when you look at this syndrome and try and figure out what's going wrong in the brain, the structures whose damage seems to lead to this are associated with attention. Damage to the inferior parietal sulcus, damage to the frontal eye fields, and other structures associated with the allocation of attention seem to lead to neglect. So people started thinking maybe attention is necessary for consciousness. And this led to now a fairly large empirical research program on healthy individuals, suggesting that if you give somebody a task that causes them to withdraw attention, consciousness goes along with it. So Mack and Rock, in a series of studies, gave people a task where they were instructed to determine which of two intersecting lines is the longer. it turns out this is a very demanding task with respect to attention. And while participants were performing the task, they would briefly flash an object. In the center of the visual field, a geometrical shape, a smiley face, it could be a proper name, or it could be a word, and so on. And what they found is a high percentage of subjects failed to see the shape, as measured by an exit interview where they said, did you see anything? No. Maybe just a little flash of something other than the crosshair? No. Maybe a geometrical shape? No. Maybe a triangle, a briefly flashed little triangle in the middle of the field. Did you see that? And people still say no, suggesting that there was no awareness of this stimulus at all with the withdrawal of attention. Now, some people, when this finding started to get some publicity, suggested that this may be a case not of inattentional blindness, but of inattentional amnesia. That is, people were perceiving that polygon, but not storing it in memory. But that account seems implausible when taken against the background of other research suggesting that this phenomenon, the removal of experience as a result of inattention, can occur even for stimuli that were presented for a longer duration. So many of you will have seen this stimulus. In any case, it won't work in this room, but just to amuse me, try to count how many times the white polygons touch the side of the screen. How many? I did.
12, and there was a little red cross.
So did anyone fail to see the red cross? Okay, you failed to see the red cross. Oh, fantastic. So I'm going to play it again, and what you'll see is that there is a little red cross. It goes right along the midline here, and it's there for 5 seconds, and it's a different shape, a different color, has a different movement trajectory. It's a different degree of value. It's a gray tone instead of a red or a white or a black. So it differs along all major visual dimensions except scale. Yet, some people fail to see it. And that's because attention is consumed by this dual task. So these kinds of findings and others like them have led some people to think that attention is necessary for consciousness. Maybe a more dramatic demonstration is this. I'm going to start this moving, and ¿qué pasó? This is verschwunden. Wow. Crazy stuff is happening. I don't know. Something weird happened with that demo. Shall we just forget that demo? We'll forget that demo. Anyways, what the demo showed is, in fact, did you see sort of invading sort of, how many of you have regular contact with the spirit world? So for the rest of you, this may have been a first. It was for me. Anyway, the finding that I was going to demonstrate is that with motion, you can also get a removal of attention that can lead to quite dramatic failures of conscious experience, suggesting, again, removal of attention leads to removal of consciousness. Contrawise, introduction of attention seems to lead to the introduction of consciousness. So if I draw your attention over here with an elaborate hand gesture, you'll become conscious of my hand, even if you hadn't been conscious of my hand a moment ago. In studying inattentional blindness, Mack and Rock found that under certain conditions, they couldn't get people to be intentionally blind. Some stimuli were just so demanding to attention that everybody saw them. Now, moments ago, on the order of an hour, I was diagnosed with a clinical condition called narcissistic personality disorder. And I assure you that while I felt a certain pang of pain in this diagnosis, because it was bad for my ego, I also felt a certain sense of camaraderie or recognition, because I knew that I would be able to report to you the following result. It turns out you're all sick. If your own name is flashed during an intentional blindness study, you will see it. You cannot be blind to your own name. It's a visual analog of the cocktail party effect. And what we find here is that everybody is sufficiently attracted to their own name that even if you have flashing lights going on that would normally draw attention away, your own name magically appears to you. Okay, so that suggests that presence of attention leads to consciousness, absence of attention leads to unconsciousness. Here's one more demonstration of presence of attention. I just like this record cover, but it's a nice example of the pop-out effect. So if you have high contrast between stimulus and surround and no attention-demanding task, it does capture our attention, and you can't but fail to be conscious of this dot. Now, a lot of you, when this was first flashed, probably all of you, were in a position to visually see the dot behind me. Now, how many of you, was a projector on my shirt? How many of you saw the hidden face in the dot behind me? None of you, because it was so subtle that it didn't demand your attention. This bright red one captured your attention. Also, there was no face there. But I want to say something of what attention is. I promise I'll get to unity soon. I want to say something of what attention is, because it will be relevant to the discussion. So in relating consciousness to attention, it's important to make sure one has an account of what form of attention is really at work. And what I want to suggest is that attention, the relevant form of attention, involves information passage. It arises when the nervous system changes its way of processing such that information in one part of the nervous system, the perceptual pathways, is able to propagate forward. And in particular, to propagate to structures associated with temporary storage of information or working memory. So we can think about attention as a kind of gateway to working memory. And the thesis that I think is supported by the neuroscientific and behavioral evidence is that consciousness arises when and only when information becomes available to working memory. And the processes that allow for that transfer are the ones we call attention. So that's the view. There is a little bit of behavioral evidence supporting the claim that that attention involves transfer to working memory. So we'll just do one little demonstration of that. So I want you to look at the red shape here, and I want you to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 for attractiveness. So I'm going to have you make an aesthetic judgment about this shape. Okay? Have you all done that? Have you all decided? Is anyone undecided? I'm talking tomorrow about evaluative intelligence, and I'm talking about aesthetic intelligence, so I just want to see if there's anyone who's aesthetically unintelligent in this room. There's a definite answer to this question. Okay, so which one was the red shape? How many of you are confident which one was the red shape? Okay, so majority. Which one was it? I wasn't. This one? This one?
Yeah.
Right? Which one was the green shape? How many of you are confident which one was the green shape? What's wrong with you people? It was right in front of you. You were staring right at it. Okay, so the point of this demonstration is that you were attending to the red shape. You had to attend to it to make the aesthetic judgment. You were actively suppressing the green shape, perhaps, in order to achieve that goal. And as a result, the red shape is the one that got encoded in memory. Your performance was exemplary. Your performance on the green shape was abominable. And the reason for that is attention is what allows information to get into memory. Okay, you're all convinced. If some of you are not convinced by behavior but need to look at pretty pictures of the brain, here are some. Boom, boom, and boom. What you find if you do cognitive neuroscience of consciousness is that all the slides, all the pictures that come up when people show contrast between conscious states and unconscious states look alike. These studies become fairly boring fairly quickly because what they tend to show is co-activation of regions of the brain associated with attention, typically the inferior parietal cortex, and regions of the brain associated with working memory, lateral frontal cortex. It's this kind of circuit linking attention and memory that seems to be the signature property of consciousness in the brain. So that's all by way of confirmation of the theory, but also to give you some sense of what attention actually is. Now, if you're interested in neural correlates of consciousness, the right question becomes not what are the neural correlates of consciousness, but we can ask what are the neural correlates of attention. If you can answer that question, you win the Nobel Prize. That's the answer to the question, what is consciousness in the brain? And this question has already been answered, but because not everybody believes consciousness is attention, the Nobel Committee hasn't been able to dole out the prize yet. So what are the neural correlates of attention? One way to find out is to torture a monkey. This monkey was implanted with electrodes and then trained to attend to one of two gradients, vertical or horizontal. And the electrodes were placed in cell populations that were sensitive differentially to these two orientations. And what you can find is that when the monkey stares or attends to say, the vertical cells, you start to see organized neuronal activity in the population that code for verticals. And if you look at the actual pattern of coding, what you find here is typically an oscillating pattern at a regular frequency. And the frequency, and this is something you've all heard before, tends to lie within the gamma range. That is between about 30 hertz on upwards. And this has become known as often the gamma theory, or sometimes the 40 hertz theory of consciousness. And what I want to suggest to you now is that the 40 hertz theory of consciousness, which I used to think was clearly wrong, turns out to gain plausibility once you link consciousness to attention. And the reason for this is that there's a fairly large body of work, though it's not uncontroversial, suggesting that attention involves 40 hertz or roughly gamma range oscillations within the nervous system. So one possible neural mechanism, one possible neural correlate of consciousness is the neural correlate of attention, and the neural correlate of attention might be 40 hertz oscillation. If you descend to a cellular level, you can actually say a little bit more about these processes. There's a good amount of evidence that's been around for a long, long time that when you get an attentional allocation to some stimulus dimension, say color, you see an increase in the bulb signal, an increase in neuronal activity corresponding to that dimension. So color centers of the brain become more active. And it was assumed initially that that increase in activation corresponded to an increase in the number of pyramidal cells that were firing. And for those of you who know about the neocortex, pyramidal cells are the primary information bearers in the brain. They're the ones that would be coding for features of the stimulus, sending information at long distances, and so on. It turns out, though, that there's pretty good reason to think that it's not the pyramidal cells that are increasing in their activity. What's actually happening, what's probably causing that big bulb increase, is an increase in interneurons and populations of cells that work locally that serve to modulate activity in the pyramidal cells. And what you get with these interneurons is an inhibitory signal. And the result, you can show this in vivo or in vitro, the result of inhibition is you get organization. You get the pyramidal cells to start firing together. And what you can actually show, even in vitro, is that these kinds of interneuron inhibition signals lead to the signature gamma oscillation. And if you get an interlocked population, you get synchronized gamma across a population of neurons under these conditions of inhibition. So if consciousness is caused by attention and attention causes inhibition, the inhibition is what's giving rise to the gamma signal. Okay. Now, I want to show you this slide because I showed you some slides before that show what fMRI gives you when you're asking about the contrast between conscious and unconscious conditions. If you look for coordinated activity, and in particular, you look for gamma responses under conditions of conscious versus unconscious activity, you also see lots of gamma. So this is from a Stan DeHaan study, and I'm going to animate these, and what you're going to see is as the time course from stimulus onset tracks down here, you'll see these little lights flare up corresponding to an increase in gamma activity. And this is a case where a stimulus was presented consciously. In a contrast condition, the same stimulus is presented followed by a mask, and it's unconscious. And there, these slides would be very boring. The animation would show no increase in gamma, no significant increase in gamma. Oops. So clock is ticking, and at about 100 milliseconds, you're going to start to see some serious action. If you look here in these sensory areas, visual areas, it's just exploding with gamma there. And the reason why I mention this is there's this beautiful coincidence between research looking for neural correlates of consciousness and finding gamma, and research looking for the neural correlates of attention and finding gamma. So it's this kind of coincidence that I think adds further support to the view that consciousness essentially involves attention, while also adding to the support to the view that the common denominator between those two is, in fact, this gamma activity. Now, the association between gamma and consciousness has been most famously raised in the context of the binding problem. And Tim writes beautifully on this topic in his book. What he says is that efforts to link consciousness to binding fail. They fail because there are lots of cases where you have bound states that are unconscious, and there are lots of cases where you have arguably unbound cases that are conscious. So just to give you a little backstory, if anyone is unfamiliar with this, it really got off the ground with a paper by Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, who drawing on some work on vision in tortured cats and other animals, were advancing the view that if you think about consciousness, our conscious experiences typically involve features that are bound together. So if you look at this green napkin, you can see its square shape, and you can see its green color. And they said the ability to bring these different features together, which are encoded in different parts of the nervous system, is important to explain. And one of the explanations that had emerged in the literature is that it might be that the green cells and the square cells are firing in synchrony. And in particular, there had been measured correlations at the range of 40 hertz. It was actually done with two parts of the same line in the initial study, but you get the point. Now, they thought that maybe binding and consciousness are one and the same. The neural correlates of consciousness and the neural correlates of binding are one and the same. But the problem is, as just forecast, there are all these cases where consciousness and binding come apart. I won't survey them here because that work is nicely done in Tim's book. So if you had been partial to the view that consciousness and binding are linked together, I think you'd be convinced by Tim that they're not. But Tim then goes on to make another claim in the book, which is that once you sever the link between consciousness and binding, you sever the link between consciousness and neural synchrony. And what I want to suggest is, actually no. For me, the main reason for thinking synchrony is important to consciousness involves attention and not binding at all. So I'm persuaded by him that we shouldn't think consciousness involves binding necessarily, but I do think consciousness involves attention, and I think synchrony is our best candidate for a neural correlate of attention. I think even, this is a point about binding, in principle you could have cases where cells corresponding to a single feature of the stimulus were firing together at the 40 hertz range. So the idea that 40 hertz is fundamentally about bringing different features together, I think is mistaken. In principle, maybe we could imagine a single cell firing at a 40 hertz oscillation rate, and for me that would be a plausible reason to think if the cell was anatomically situated in the right place to attribute consciousness to that cell. So it's really about this oscillation frequency more than about synchrony even, and certainly more than about binding. Okay. That was a long detour. Now I want to come back to our main topic, which is unity. And I want to say something about how this neural synchrony story might relate to a theory of the unity of consciousness. But beginning with attention, if you think consciousness is attention, then you need to ask, how do two conscious states get bound together as a whole? How do we get unified as a whole? Now, one way to think about this, which is I think usefully suggested by Tim's subsumption language, is to say unity of conscious states consists in two states being subsumed by a third. And that way of bookkeeping in terms of, that sort of implies three different states there, but that's all just a way of talking. Really what the subsumption concept suggests is that when we think about two things as part of the same conscious state, we should think that there's a single conscious state that happens to have both of these as features. So the question becomes, how do you individuate conscious states? Now, one way to approach that question is to come up with a theory of consciousness, and then let that theory dictate the conditions of state individuation. Now, if you think that a theory of consciousness should include reference to attention, and attention is explained by neural synchrony, then you might say our best independently motivated theory of conscious state individuation is a collection of neurons that are firing together at 40 hertz. That's a conscious state. Now, that theory of conscious states is advanced prior to any discussion of unity. But it's easy to apply to unity, because now you can say, well, what makes two things going on in the brain part of the same conscious state? And the answer is already given by our theory of conscious state individuation. If they're firing synchronously, or at least phase locked, if their firing profile is linked together in a way within this particular oscillation frequency, then they constitute a single state. So the theory of unity of consciousness now becomes cells are unified in a single conscious state if they are synchronized together within the gamma range. I just used the word phase locking before, the phrase phase locking, and I just want to register that if I were speaking more carefully in this talk, I would use phase locking rather than synchrony throughout. And the reason for that is it's not crucial that the cells peak at the same time, that they actually discharge at the same time. What's crucial very often in the findings linking gamma to consciousness and attention is phase locking, such that the profile of peaking between two cells or two population of cells is correlated. So you could have cells peaking at the trough of another cellular activity, and that could count as phase locking as well. So as applied to unity, we can think about this story just to summarize as going something like this. These two different brain events would be unified if they're synchronized together or if they're phase locked together. That would be the basic story. So we have built into the synchrony theory of consciousness a fairly straightforward synchrony theory of the unity of consciousness. Now, I want to pause for a minute and say something about time. Time came up briefly in Lizzie's talk, and time. We have actually Barry Danton has written, I think, some of the best philosophical work on time that I know of. Ian Phillips, who's also here, has written some of the best philosophical work that I know of. So there are time people in the room. Tim's book primarily talks about what can be thought of as spatial unity. So, say two features of the same scene going on at the same time, getting bound together. Maybe we could call that synchronic unity. But there's also diachronic unity, as he mentions. And there's a question, how does that occur? Now, if you think about unity in terms of some kind of synchrony, diachronic unity becomes difficult to explain. How do you explain how two consecutive episodes in the nervous system are unified as one? How do these things become part of a single conscious state? And I think with a little bit of finessing, the neural oscillation story can be adapted to say something about diachronic unity as well. One way to approach the question is to ask the perennial philosophical question, how long is the moment? How long is a conscious moment? And I think this turns out to be a somewhat tricky question to answer. It's a somewhat vexed question because there are different things we might mean by moments and different ways to individuate them. So I'm going to introduce a little bit of terminology quickly. I think we can talk first of all about what might be thought of as the present. And just to kind of get you going on the idea of the present, you might think of the present as something roughly mnemonic. Like if you think back now to this present moment, you think, when did it begin? There are certainly things in the very, very recent past, on the order of, say, half of a second or a second, that seem like they might be part of this present. But if I asked you, was the title slide of this talk, is that going on now? Is that part of the present? You might say no. I mean, there's a notion of present, like the present tense, or maybe yes. But if you ask, is that part of your psychological present, the first title slide, you might say no. But suppose I give you a polysyllabic word, like mandelbaum, and ask, okay, when you heard the baum, was that a different present than the man? Does the man come apart from the tree? There, I think your intuitions might be no, that there's a sense in which Mandelbaum could be captured in a single present moment. But if you ask, are you simultaneously present of the man and the baum? No, that would sound like, I can't say it. When you say man while I say baum, it's polyphonic. So, one. Damn it! Anyway, you got the point. How long is the present? I think it's between 2 and 3.5 seconds. There's a lot of science behind this. It turns out 3 seconds is a kind of magical number in the psychology of time. It's a magical number because it crops up again and again and again. So, for example, if you have people listen to music and try and repeat the melody accurately, they're very accurate up to about 3 seconds. And then after that, they really just tail off. If you look at the data plots of this, it's quite striking. where it's just perfect fidelity and then suddenly catastrophe strikes. 3 seconds is also the time course of inhibition of return, which is to say we tend to not attend to the same moment, to the same location twice consecutively, but we will return our attention after 3 seconds. It turns out to be an important time interval for parsing actions. So if you look at body movements, they tend to be in 3-second intervals. If you are pouring a cup of water, you'll get 3-second partitions before each step making up that pour. So it shows up again and again. It turns out to be a very interesting number. I think it probably has to do with something like the duration of something like a short-term memory buffer, like an iconic memory buffer. You can think about it as the memory for what you've attended to. And the present seems to be limited by the boundaries of memory for attention. But there's also a kind of notion of the moment that is the briefest interval at which one can have an experience. And in vision, that looks an awful lot like it's something around 25 milliseconds. You can show this by flicker detection thresholds. So how long does a flicker need to be present in a computer monitor before it's seen? At 25 milliseconds, they start to become visible. With mass priming, how long does the stimulus need to be present in order to be visible? And the answer is more than 25 milliseconds. Have I been saying seconds and not milliseconds? Okay, I have no memory for that. Anyway, so I think it's going to turn out that the instant is probably something on the order of 25 milliseconds. And it turns out, if you do the math, if you do 40 hertz, they're basically this basically works out to be a 25 millisecond cycle. So a single gamma beat is basically 25 milliseconds. So I'm not going to put these pieces together for you because I don't quite know how yet. But I think this is not coincidental. I think a single conscious moment may be a single gamma beat. It turns out that with respect to detection of things like consecutive stimuli, two stimuli that are presented consecutively, there are also measurable thresholds. So if I present two stimuli consecutively, say 2 tones, or a flash in a tone, or 2 flashes, and present them within a 25 millisecond threshold, you won't see that there are 2. They'll blend together as 1. If I present 2 tones and present them for about 40 or 50 milliseconds, fascinatingly, you'll know that there are 2, but you won't know their order, their sequence. So it seems like you need to move above 60 milliseconds before you can sequence events. And I think this notion of succession may give us another notion of the moment, which turns out to be, which I'm going to just call the now, which turns out to be somewhere maybe around 100 milliseconds. 60 milliseconds may already start to get it with visual stimuli and auditory stimuli, but somewhere between 60 and 100 milliseconds, you get this point at which we can discriminate consecutive events. I think that turns out to be an interesting number as well with respect to the gamma hypothesis for the following reason. There are a lot of different oscillation frequencies measurable in the brain. One of them is gamma. But there are other slower oscillation frequencies that are measurable as well. And one that crops up very often in studies of attention is alpha, which is about a 100 millisecond interval. And it turns out there's some evidence that gamma beats are nested in alpha beats. That is, they're phase locked such that you get a group of gammas that are actually nested within a continuous alpha beat. If you plot them, you'll see something like this, where the blue ones are the gammas, and the red ones are the alphas. The black ones correspond to the peaks, the average peaks in the gamma cycle. And if you just look at this visually, you can see a geometrical relationship between the alpha and the gamma cycle. And it turns out that there are these drops in gamma activity at the intervals between alpha beats. And you can actually get people to fail to consciously perceive a stimulus if you time the stimulus so it falls at one of these alpha troughs. And I think what's going on here is that the alpha cycle is basically organizing, it's playing a regulative role in getting the gamma cycles to work. And one way to think about this with respect to the experience of time is that what gets done here is a kind of unifying process where the alpha is creating an orderly gamma process. And you can think about it, a temporally bounded but unified chunk of experience as basically all the gamma beats that occur within an alpha beat. It's actually a band called the Alpha Beats. They have one really good song. They're one of these bands where the first track is awesome and the rest really sucks. Anyway. Okay, so that's a story about unity of consciousness. I want to now move, and this will be the final part of the talk, to two implications, which I think bear on Tim's story. So I thank you and Tim for indulging my patience in laying out that positive view. The first implication bears on his unity thesis. And I think that if conscious unity involves synchronization, then we should expect the possibility of simultaneous conscious episodes that are disunified. And the reason for that is it seems to me, and there's empirical support for this, that you could get populations of cells going on in sensory areas at the same time that are all firing at gamma, but the gamma populations are not themselves phase-locked. So you could have an auditory signal that was firing at gamma, a visual signal firing at gamma, but there's no correlation between the gamma activity in audition and in vision. So I think basically you should be able to get cases like this. So this team would not win the Olympic tournament, but it does look like the kind of thing that could occur in the nervous system. One principal reason for thinking that it can occur is there are a lot of control structures for attention. So if you look at the brain and find how attention works, at the cellular level, I think there's a common denominator. It's this 40 hertz story. But what gets our cells to fire at 40 hertz? I mentioned something about alpha and about interneurons and that kind of thing, all again at the local level. But what sets these alpha cycles off? What gets the interneurons going? The answer there seems to be pluralistic in the sense that there are a lot of different ways we can regulate our attention. Think about this behaviorally for a minute. Sometimes attention is drawn bottom up by the stimulus, like that. Sometimes it's drawn top down. So if I ask you to look for yellow items in the room, we can all do that, and we do that by visual search, and we allocate attention, and we're quite adept at it. The yellow items weren't salient a moment ago, but they become very salient when you do a visual search. And that's because you're using a template top down as a filter on your input, on your incoming visual experience. We can use top-down control to attend to the same stimulus as it moves through space with visual tracking, to monitor a scene, waiting for something to happen, and so on. There are a lot of different ways to control where attention is going to get allocated, and they're anatomically separable. But if you have all these different attentional control structures, then it looks like the engineering of the brain should allow that two different things are regulating attention at the same time. And there's no reason to assume that those control structures will coincide on the same pattern of neuronal organization. There's no reason to think that simultaneous top-down and bottom-up attention will lead to cell populations that are both going in a phase-locked way within 40 hertz. So I want to suggest that anatomically there's reason to think that you could have multiple streams of consciousness that were not unified if attention is consciousness and if attention is 40 hertz oscillation. Now, I think there might be sort of cases in experience that are plausible evidence for this, though I'll hedge this claim in a moment. Consider in this room, there's a slight background hum of the AC units. I don't know if you can hear it now, but I heard it before. It's there. So you might have been hearing it all along. It might even be part of your conscious experience. But was that part of the experience that was bound together with the stream of consciousness that's reporting to you the content of my speech? Maybe not. So in some of these cases where we notice peripheral items in experience, or even some of you might have had the experience of, say, listening to music while doing something visual. And I don't know if this phenomenology sounds familiar to you, but the sense that you might be experiencing both of these things without thinking at all about how they relate to each other is familiar enough, and that might turn out to be a case of disunified consciousness as well. Behaviorally in the laboratory, one possible phenomenon that bears on this is the phenomenon of illusory conjunctions. So I just presented to you a grid of letters and they were colored. Here's an instruction. Write down as many letters and their colors as you can remember. And then you do, I'm going to flash them again. Are you ready? Even tried to get the spatial configuration of the colors because it might have been too quick to encode the letter identity is somewhat difficult. You may have a high degree of confidence that there was an orange there or a green. Probably, how many of you saw the yellow? So yellow had already been primed, and it also contrasts maybe more at the background, gets a lot of pop out, even though it's the worst of the primary colors. I say there's objective fact as an aesthetic expert. By the way, this is an aside, as you'll recognize by the content of what I'm about to say. But oh my God, Gauguin knows orange. How many of you could tell me the color of the letters? So the thought is we very often, in seeing an object that has a color presented quickly in a grid, in an array, know what colors we've seen and what objects we've seen, but we can't place them together. So people like Anne Friesman have done this nice work showing that people generate illusory conjunctions where they're not really sure which color went with which object, and they make a lot of errors on recall when reporting these facts. Possibly, this has to do with the fact that with brief presentations, our conscious experience of color and our conscious experience of shape have not yet been unified into a single experience. Possibly. It might just be a timing error. This is a diagram of experiment that Tim discusses in the book, and I think he's going to come back to it in his own discussion. It's a case of split brain research where an individual with a separated corpus callosum is presented tachistoscopically with two different words. And any of us seeing key and ring would integrate these together into a single concept. So instead of thinking of a key and a ring, we would think of the kind of key ring. But if you have a sectioned corpus callosum, you see both of these words individually, and you're able to report verbally on what's presented to the left visual field, the word ring, and with your action, in this case picking up objects, you can register that there had been a key presented. And split brain cases, as Lizzie mentioned in her talk in some detail, have been taken as evidence for failures of unity of consciousness, because the natural thing to say about a patient with a split brain is that she's actually experiencing both of these words simultaneously, but in separate streams of consciousness. These streams can't be brought together under these experimental conditions. And Tim's discussion of split brain research is extremely rich. He ultimately explores, as Lizzie brought out nicely, the possibility that in these patients, what you're getting is some kind of switching. That is, it's not that you have a simultaneous experience of ring and a simultaneous experience of key, it's that there's an alternation between these. Now, on the attention view, if you think consciousness involves attention, you might say, oh no, this can't be unified consciousness because there are separate attention mechanisms in each hemisphere. But Tim anticipates this reply. And he shows through a review of the scientific literature that actually there's a fair amount of attentional integration in split brain patients. So you actually could get the hemispheres coordinated together with respect to attention, even in cases where the corpus callosum has been sectioned. So a view that relates consciousness to attention doesn't prove that there is a separation of streams of consciousness in the split brain cases. As Tim points out, the literature is inconsistent and complicated. Some studies suggest separable allocations of attention, others don't. But he thinks empirically it remains an open possibility that there's some sort of switch. Now, I don't want to say a lot about the switching hypothesis, but I want to mention one thing because it relates back to that issue about time. In fact, there are two issues that pertain to time. One of them has to do with whether the switching account can do adequate justice to the intuition that consciousness is diachronically unified. That's something Lizzie discussed and something that Tim discusses in the book. But another kind of worry having to do with time has to do with how much time is required to switch attention. So if you think about consciousness as attention, and you think about the switching hypothesis as requiring a switch in attention, the question becomes, do individuals in these split brain studies have enough time to switch attention from one hemisphere to another? And I won't present to you the numerical data on this, but I suspect not. And it has to do with the duration of the present. How long is the present?
2.5 to 3 seconds.
Oh, you get an A. That was the pop quiz. How many of you did not know the answer to that question? This is like this fantastic fact. If you learn nothing else from the content of my talk, you've learned the duration of the present, goddammit. And you forgot this, and it's really, really disappointing to me. Anyway, the present is 2.5 to 3 seconds. And it turns out another way in which that number crops up in the research is in switching from one interpretation of a bistable figure to another. So if I present to you a Necker cube or a duck rabbit and measure spontaneous switching, it looks like it happens at about every 3 seconds. It also turns out to be the switching rate for bistable figures presented binocularly in the context of binocular rivalry. So if you present one stimulus to the left eye and another to the right eye, and they're equally high in stimulus contrast, you won't experience both overlapping, you'll experience one or the other. How long does it take for you to spontaneously go from one to the other? About 3 seconds, that magic number, the attentional memory number. Okay? Now, what I want to suggest is that there are different ways to measure time cost of attentional switching, and I'm only mentioning this particular result. But it remains an empirical hypothesis that needs testing to show that the switching hypothesis of split brain patients is plausible. In the classic split brain studies, stimuli were presented for 100 milliseconds, and there's they're not masked. So there's an iconic memory that probably lingers past that for another couple hundred milliseconds. So they're getting a stimulus presentation that we might say generously is on the order of a second. And the question is, can you switch attention bilaterally with a stimulus that has that duration? I don't know the answer to this empirically, but at least it gives us one place where we might go in and start to empirically test the switching hypothesis. I suspect, given the magic number 3, that that's attentional switching from one hemisphere to another takes longer. Okay, a second implication, and then I'm going to stop. Well, close to the end here. I've said that it's possible that consciousness can be divided. That is, if consciousness involves attention and attention involves synchrony, you might have different synchronized populations. So I think the unity hypothesis, given the structure of consciousness, might turn out to be false. I said before that we might have cases in life that resemble this, like listening to that hum of the air conditioner in the background. But some of you might have been inclined to flatly deny that and say, no, it's obvious to me that I wasn't experiencing that air conditioner, and as soon as you brought it to my attention, of course I experienced it then, because you're right, Jessie, attention is consciousness. But I experienced it along with your voice and all these other things that were going on. And what I want to suggest is that using introspection, using phenomenology to settle whether consciousness can be disunified may never work. And it may never work in principle. And the reason for this has to do with what's known in consciousness studies and elsewhere as the refrigerator light illusion. It may just work out that whenever we look for whether two mental states are unified, they become unified. They unify together. And the reason for this is actually explained and predicted by the theory that relates consciousness to attention. Think about how this would work. Ask yourselves right now whether what you're hearing and what you're seeing are part of a single conscious experience. How do you do that? You do that by an act of introspection. And the act of introspection works, I think, by attention. Basically, you're attending to the two simultaneously. You're asking a comparative question about two sensory states. And that requires attending to the two simultaneously. But allocation of top-down attention to two stimuli simultaneously from the same control source leads to neural synchrony. So as soon as you attend to the two stimuli in a comparative mode, you've resulted in a single phenomenal state. That is, unity is there whenever we look for it. We can't experience this unity directly. Now, Tim has a wonderful discussion of the refrigerator light illusion, and he raises a kind of challenge. And the challenge goes something like this. It says, if you can't give a principled explanation for why unity should occur when and only when we introspect, then this hypothesis shouldn't be taken seriously. And as a result, the introspective data that consciousness seems to be unified should generalize. We should say if it seems to be unified, it just is unified. Unless you can give a principled reason for why there should be an illusion, you should assume that all consciousness is unified. So what I've tried to offer is a sort of principled reason for why consciousness seems unified when we look for it. So I'm offering that as a possible reply to Tim's arguments in the book. So going from the unity judgment, that is the intuition from introspection that consciousness is unified, to the unified thesis, which says that all conscious states are unified, may be an unwarranted inference. I think an even better analogy than the refrigerator light illusion is this. If you have a group of officers and you're some sort of officer, a group of soldiers and you're some sort of officer in the military, whenever you walk into the room, they all line up in perfect synchrony and attention. But when you leave the room, God knows what they're doing. They may be, all doing totally different things. So as soon as you come in, they're all unified, but when you're not there, they're not. So I think the analogy here would be that when we look for the unity between two conscious states, they, like a group of soldiers, obey our commands and get nice and tidy. Okay. This is another angle on the picture we have in front of the scene, in front of the beginning of the talks. Let me end just briefly because I want to pose one more question for Tim, because it's majorly a question, I think, for clarification. And it was a theme in Lizzie's talk as well. One reason, a positive reason one might give for denying the disunity thesis, the thesis that conscious states are sometimes disunified, has to do with Tim's detailed argument against atomism. So Tim favors a holistic view according to which the various things we're conscious of constitute a single conscious state. But we can't think of conscious state as being built up of separable parts. We should think about the whole state as the basic unit. Even though the unit has different features, the whole state is the basic unit. What I want to suggest is that I'm an atomist. I chose this picture because it looks like the kind of structure of an atom in the background of Tim, so I'm suspecting that he's an atomist too. But Tim claims to be a holist, and he claims to reject atomism. He thinks atomism is a terribly unsuccessful hypothesis within philosophy of perception and consciousness studies and cognitive science more broadly. He thinks it's a total bomb. Briefly, here are his reasons. He thinks that atomism is going to have difficulty explaining the fact that many of our conscious states are bound together. Now, not all of them are. He argues for that. But when they do get bound together, what does it mean to say the two components of, say, our color and shape experience are separable atoms when they can be bound together into a coherent whole? How can atomism explain binding? How can atomism explain the fact that our senses are constantly in interaction with each other? So, for example, in the McGurk Effect, when somebody says "ba" but makes a mouth movement, you see this through trick photography, corresponding to another syllable like "fa," you might hear a third syllable like "da," and suddenly it sounds like a Kurt Schwitter's poem. This joke, that joke didn't work. Anyway, the point is, if you're getting the senses talking to each other in this active way, that seems to be difficult to square with the idea that you have these different, separable, independent atoms of experience. The fact that what gets into experience depends on very holistic factors, stimulus competition and so on, is an indication, again, of very holistic processing, not this kind of atomistic processing. Why don't we just have a separate channel for each aspect of experience that just delivers conscious qualia quite independent of what the others are doing? The fact that in experience we often seem to have focal objects and then a broad encompassing background that's sort of there for everything suggests a picture on which the little focal items in experience are integrated in some sort of holistic way against the backdrop of this background. How does that background seem to be a background for everything if it's just another atom, one little unit among many? And finally, he says unity itself might be difficult to explain on an atomistic picture. So my question for Tim is sort of, I guess most concisely put by I don't get it. By which I mean I want to hear more here about why atomism can't explain these kinds of things. So take a typical theory of binding that says two features are bound together functionally if there's some sort of psychological template that keeps them causally unified in such a way that, say, the organism treats both features as occupying the same region of space. or causal integration. I mean, integration can be caused by causal interaction, such that in one sense, atoms in one sense knock into atoms in another sense. Or competition, again, you could have atoms knocking into each other, competing with each other for ultimate control over, say, action systems or memory systems. Or the background. Well, in some sense, the background is a separable and independent component of experience. There might be many components because backgrounds are complex, but you can take, just to take a simple case, if you think of the visual background of some focal stimulus, you can think about it as comprised as it is on the screen of a bunch of independent pixels. And unity, I've already tried to give you an atomistic theory of unity in terms of the atoms functioning together synchronically. And now it may be that I'm really a holist and I don't realize it. So Tim rejects, I think, rightly, various implausible theories of holism. Maybe to be a holist is just to have a theory of mental state individuation, in virtue of which you could say that two features of a stimulus can be part of the same mental state. The Synchrony story allows me to say that. So I think the answer to my question is, you are a holist, you idiot, you're not an atomist. But if I'm an atomist, I don't see, by Hume, that was an inadvertent compliment. By Tim's definition of atomism, I don't see why atomists can't explain these things, so that will be a final question. But the basic conclusion I want to draw is that I think that Tim is extremely compelling, he's extremely effective in giving arguments for the unity thesis based on the theories of consciousness he examines. I think he's very compelling in offering some rebuttals of efforts to show empirically that the unity thesis is false. I also very much like his framework for thinking about what unity even is, and his rejection of certain other proposals, like a certain kind of closure principle that hasn't been much discussed so far in today's session. So at the level of detail, I'm hugely persuaded by much of what Tim has to say. But I think there might be another approach to conscious unity that he might want to respond to that may offer an independent reason for thinking that conscious states can be disunified, and that's the neural synchrony theory that links consciousness to attention and attention to synchrony. If synchrony is the feature that causes unity, then by the same measure, synchrony should be capable of generating disunity even during the same moment in time. So let me end there and just say a final word of thanks to Tim for a wonderful book.